I made one mistake behind the foxwoman, and she didn't take it lightly. The forbidden touch. The Hall of Silver Winds lived up to its name as Theron Ashwood entered, his diplomatic robes feeling suddenly inadequate among the sea of elegant foxfolk nobility. Crystalline chandeliers caught the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting prismatic patterns across marble floors. He'd been warned that Starfall Sanctum operated on protocols human ambassadors rarely mastered, but seeing it firsthand made his studied preparation feel woefully insufficient. Silvara Moonwhisper moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her silver-white fur catching light like moonbeams made solid. As his assigned attaché, she'd greeted him with professional courtesy earlier, those amber eyes assessing him with an intelligence that made him stand straighter. Now, watching her navigate the pre-ceremony gathering, Theron couldn't help but admire how naturally she commanded respect. Her elegant posture, the way her ornate robes complemented rather than concealed her form, the subtle flick of her magnificent tail that others seemed to read like a second language. The ceremony bell chimed, and the crowd shifted toward the central dais. Theron moved with the flow, his attention caught by an elaborate tapestry depicting ancient FoxClan history. He stepped backward for a better view, not realizing Silvara had paused directly behind him to speak with an elder. His hand, reaching to adjust his collar, grazed something impossibly soft. The effect was instantaneous. Silvara's entire body stiffened, her tail jerking away from the contact. The conversations around them faltered, then stopped completely. Theron turned to find her amber eyes blazing with something between shock and fury, her ears flat against her head. The hall had gone silent enough to hear the wind whistling through the high windows. Outside, now. Her voice was controlled, but Theron heard the tremor beneath it. She led him through a side door onto a balcony overlooking the cloudscape, the ceremonial hall's warmth giving way to cool mountain air. Silvara gripped the railing, her tail coiled tightly against her body. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" She turned to face him, and Theron saw her struggling to maintain composure. "In my culture, touching a fox's tail without permission is—" She broke off, searching for words. "It's intimate, profoundly so. You might as well have—" "I'm so sorry." Theron's horror was genuine and complete. "I swear I didn't know. I wasn't paying attention, and I never meant to." Learning the dance. The days following the incident passed with excruciating formality. Silvara maintained her duties as Theron's attaché with impeccable professionalism, but the easy conversations they'd begun building vanished behind walls of protocol. Theron threw himself into cultural studies with desperate intensity, spending late nights in the Sanctum's library scrolling through texts on FoxClan customs, social hierarchies, and the intricate language of tail movements. He learned that a tail held high indicated confidence and pride, while a low sweep suggested caution or submission. A sharp flick communicated irritation, while gentle swaying revealed contentment. The base of the tail, where he'd accidentally made contact, was considered the most intimate zone, a place reserved for family, closest friends, or romantic partners. His mistake hadn't just been inappropriate, it had been devastatingly personal. During a diplomatic dinner in the Constellation Chamber, Theron found himself seated across from Silvara and several other delegates. The evening proceeded smoothly until a visiting envoy from the Southern Territories, emboldened by fermented honey wine, made a crude observation about foxwomen and their exotic appeal. The comment was met with uncomfortable silence. Theron's response was immediate and sharp. "Ambassador Curell, perhaps you're unfamiliar with the principle that our host's dignity deserves the same respect we expect for our own people. I suggest you remember that cultural exchange requires actual respect, not objectification." The table fell silent. Curel's face flushed, but he offered no rebuttal. When Theron glanced at Silvara, he caught the briefest flash of surprise in her amber eyes, followed by something that might have been approval. Her tail, which had been coiled defensively throughout dinner, relaxed slightly. After the meal, as guests dispersed toward the Sky Gardens for evening refreshments, Theron found himself walking the same crystalline pathway he'd taken to walking each night. The gardens were luminescent under the stars, night-blooming flowers releasing subtle fragrances that reminded him why he'd requested this posting. "You've been reading," Silvara's voice came from behind him, not startling but welcome. He turned to find her standing near a flowering arbor, her robes shifting in the gentle breeze. "I wanted to understand," he said simply, "not just the rules, but the reasons behind them." She moved closer, her footsteps silent on the crystal path. Most humans don't bother. They memorize protocols without comprehending the meaning. Her tail swayed gently, a movement he now recognized as contemplative. "You defended me tonight." "I defended basic decency, though I'd be lying if I said it wasn't personal." Silvara studied him for a long moment, moonlight catching the silver undertones in her fur. "Walk with me," she said, and it wasn't quite a command. As they moved through the gardens, she began speaking about her childhood in the high peaks, about the traditions that shaped her people, about the loneliness of always maintaining perfect composure. Theron listened, asking questions that demonstrated his recent studies while never pretending to be more knowledgeable than he was. When they reached the garden's overlook, the city spreading below them in glittering lights, Silvara's tail brushed lightly against his leg. Whether intentionally or not, Theron couldn't tell, but he remained perfectly still, letting her control every aspect of their proximity. She noticed, and the smallest smile touched her lips. The gift of understanding. 3 weeks into his ambassadorship, Theron commissioned work from Master Silvran, the Sanctum's most renowned metalsmith. He'd sketched the design himself after consulting historical texts, wanting to ensure every detail held cultural significance rather than human presumption. The artisan had raised an approving eyebrow at the unusual request from a human, but agreed to the work. The Observatory of Falling Stars became Theron's favorite location in the Sanctum, a domed chamber with transparent crystal panels that made visitors feel suspended among the constellations. He'd asked Silvara to meet him there after her evening duties, specifying only that he had something to show her, not gift her, giving her the freedom to refuse whatever he offered. She arrived wearing simpler robes than her formal attire, her fur brushed to lustrous perfection. "You've been secretive," she observed, though her tone carried curiosity rather than suspicion. Theron withdrew a slender wooden box from his satchel. "I wanted to apologize properly, not with words, since I've already exhausted those, but with understanding." He opened the box to reveal a delicate silver chain adorned with 3 moonstone charms, each carved with symbols representing respect, patience, and trust. Silvara's breath caught audibly. Her hand moved toward the chain, then hesitated. "Theron, do you know what this is?" "A tail ornament," he said quietly, "traditionally given to honor boundaries rather than claim intimacy. The moonstones represent the 3 virtues necessary for any relationship between foxfolk, romantic or otherwise. I'm not presuming anything beyond your forgiveness and, perhaps, friendship." Her amber eyes glimmered with emotion as she lifted the chain from its velvet cushion. The silver caught starlight filtering through the observatory dome, the moonstones glowing with their characteristic inner luminescence. "The craftsmanship is exquisite, and you chose the traditional clasp design, the one that can only be worn if the recipient places it themselves or accepts help from someone they trust." "I studied the variations. I didn't want to create something that assumed permission I haven't earned." Silvera was quiet for a long moment, her tail moving in complex patterns he'd learned indicated deep thought mixed with emotional conflict. Finally, she turned slightly, holding the chain toward him. "The clasp is deliberately difficult," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "You would help me." Theron's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hands remained steady as he took the chain. Silvera's tail, that magnificent appendage he'd accidentally violated weeks ago, slowly uncurled from its protective position. She held it extended, the base of it positioned at a height he could reach without awkward positioning. The trust implicit in the gesture made his chest tighten. He moved carefully, bringing the chain around the base of her tail where the fur transitioned from her body. The silver sat perfectly against the soft white fur, the moonstones catching light as they settled into position. The clasp required careful threading, his fingers working inches from the sensitive area he'd once touched in ignorance. Silvera remained perfectly still, though he could see the subtle tension in her shoulders. When the clasp clicked softly into place, Silvera released a breath she'd been holding. She turned to face him, her tail moving experimentally, the chain catching light with each motion. "It's perfect," she whispered. Then, before he could respond, she stepped closer, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "Thank you for learning, for trying, for seeing me more than just your diplomatic assignment." The space between them felt charged with possibility as stars wheeled overhead through the crystal dome. Theron remained still, letting her control the moment, but his eyes held hers with unmistakable emotion. "I stopped being just an assignment the moment you gave me that first lecture on the balcony. You could have humiliated me publicly. Instead, you educated me privately. That kind of grace is rare." Silvera's tail, now adorned with his carefully chosen gift, curved gently toward him, a gesture he now understood meant welcome and openness. The moonstone charms chimed softly with the movement, a delicate sound that seemed to belong to this moment alone. Beneath the lunar gardens. The Moon Bloom Festival arrived with 3 days of celebration, transforming Starfall Sanctum into a realm of ethereal beauty. Luminescent flowers, blooming only once per year, cascaded from every terrace and archway, their petals releasing a soft phosphorescent glow that turned night into twilight. Foxfolk from across the realm gathered in their finest ceremonial attire, and the air hummed with music from traditional string instruments that seemed to capture the very essence of starlight. Theron had expected to attend as a diplomatic observer, standing respectfully at the periphery of cultural celebration. Instead, a formal invitation arrived in his quarters, written in Silvera's elegant script. "Would you honor me with your presence as my personal guest, not as ambassador, but as the person who took the time to truly understand?" When he met her in the grand pavilion, his breath caught. Silvera wore ceremonial robes of midnight blue silk that seemed woven from the sky itself, embroidered with silver thread and patterns depicting moon phases. Her fur had been brushed until it gleamed, and the chain he'd gifted her rested at the base of her tail, the moonstones glowing softly with each graceful movement. She looked like a vision from ancient legends, beautiful and slightly otherworldly. "You're staring," she observed, though her tone held amusement rather than reproach. "I'm appreciating," Theron offered, offering his arm in the formal gesture he'd learned. "There's a difference." She accepted with a smile that transformed her usually composed features, and they moved through the celebration together. Silvera introduced him not as the human ambassador, but simply as Theron, and the distinction mattered. They sampled delicacies from vendor stalls, sweet lunar cakes and spiced honey wine, and watched traditional dances performed by acrobatic foxfolk who seemed to defy gravity itself. As evening deepened into true night, Silvera led him away from the main celebrations toward the secluded grove of silver willows at the garden's heart. Here, the moon blooms grew most abundantly, their luminescence creating a canopy of living light. The music from the pavilion drifted through the trees, softer but no less beautiful. "There's a tradition," Silvara said, turning to face him in the glowing grove, "that during the festival we dance in these gardens to honor the moon and the connections we've forged throughout the year." Her tail swayed gently, the chain's charms creating a delicate musical accompaniment. "Would you dance with me, Theron, not as diplomat and attaché, but as two people who've learned to see each other truly?" Theron stepped closer, placing one hand carefully at her waist while taking her hand in his other. "I'd be honored, though I should warn you, human dancing may not match foxfolk grace." "Then I'll teach you," she murmured, and began to move. The dance was unlike anything Theron had learned in human courts, fluid and intuitive, requiring attention to subtle cues and responding to your partner's movements rather than following rigid patterns. Silvara guided him with gentle pressure, her body close enough that he could feel her warmth, smell the subtle fragrance of night-blooming jasmine in her fur. As they moved beneath the luminescent canopy, something shifted between them. Silvara's tail, which had remained carefully neutral throughout the dance, slowly curved forward until it brushed intentionally against his leg. Theron's entire body tensed, not with fear, but with awareness of the significance. She felt his reaction and laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. "You're allowed to acknowledge it," she said softly, her amber eyes reflecting the moonbloom's glow. "I'm choosing to touch you this time." Theron's heart thundered in his chest. "I don't want to presume." Silvara stopped dancing but didn't step away. Instead, she reached down and carefully took his hand, the one not resting at her waist. Slowly, deliberately, she guided it to rest near the base of her tail, just below where the silver chain gleamed. Her fur was impossibly soft beneath his palm, and he could feel the subtle tension in her muscles, the vulnerability in allowing him this contact. "Trust isn't taken," she whispered, her face now inches from his. "It's given, and I'm choosing to give it to you." The space between them disappeared as Theron leaned forward, giving her every opportunity to retreat. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was tender and unhurried, tasting of honey wine and promise. Her tail curved more firmly around his waist, an embrace uniquely hers, while his hand remained steady where she had placed it, respectful even in intimacy. When they finally parted, both breathing slightly harder, Silvara rested her forehead against his. "I didn't expect this," she admitted. "When you first arrived, I thought you'd be like all the others, memorizing rules without understanding meaning." "I didn't expect this either," Theron replied, his thumb gently stroking the soft fur beneath his palm, marveling that she trusted him enough for such contact. They remained in the silver willow grove as the Moonbloom Festival continued around them, dancing and talking and stealing kisses beneath the luminescent flowers, building something neither had anticipated but both now cherished.
The choice to stay. The notice arrived 6 weeks later with brutal efficiency. Ambassador Ashwood's term expires in 14 days. Prepare for transition briefings and departure protocols. Standard diplomatic language that suddenly felt like a sentencing. Theron sat in his quarters, the document trembling slightly in his hands. He'd known this was temporary when he accepted the posting, but that was before Silvara, before late-night conversations in the observatory, before learning that her laugh sounded like wind chimes, before discovering that she hummed old folk songs while reviewing documents and always chose the window seat to watch sunrises, before falling completely, irrevocably in love with her. Silvara had grown increasingly quiet over the past 3 days, since the notice became public knowledge. She maintained her duties with characteristic precision, but Theron noticed the little changes, how her tail remained coiled protectively, how her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes, how she found reasons to leave rooms before conversations could turn personal. On what was scheduled to be his final evening, Theron went searching for her. He found her in the highest tower of the sanctum, a small observation room that few knew existed. She stood at the window, silhouetted against the endless expanse of clouds and distant mountains painted gold by the setting sun. "I thought I might find you here," Theron said softly. Silvara didn't turn. "I come here when I need to think, to remember that the world is vast and that people are meant to move through it, not stay in one place forever." "Is that what you believe? That nothing should be permanent?" "I believe in being realistic." Her voice carried carefully controlled emotion. "You have a life in the human territories, a career, family. I was foolish to let myself forget that this was always going to be temporary." Theron moved to stand beside her at the window. "What if I told you I've spent the last week sending correspondence to every relevant authority in human diplomatic circles?" That made her turn, confusion flickering across her features. "What?" "I requested an indefinite extension of my posting, not as a standard ambassadorial term, but as a permanent liaison position. It required calling in favors, restructuring my entire career trajectory, and probably burning bridges with administrators who think I'm throwing away opportunities." I turned to face her fully. "But none of that matters if you don't want me to stay." Silvara's amber eyes widened, her carefully maintained composure cracking. You'd give up your advancement? Your connections in human territories?" "I'm not giving up anything that matters. I'm choosing what I want. I'm choosing you, Silvara, if you'll have me. Not for a few more weeks or months, but for as long as you'll tolerate my presence." A sound escaped her that was half laugh, half sob. Her tail, which had been coiled so tightly, suddenly loosened and curved toward him. "You beautiful fool," she whispered, and then she was closing the distance between them, her arms wrapping around his neck as her tail encircled his waist. Their kiss was deeper this time, carrying weeks of growing attachment and the relief of uncertainty resolved. Theron's hands moved to her waist, then, slowly, reverently, to the base of her tail where the silver chain rested. She shivered at the contact, but pressed closer, giving permission through action rather than words. "My quarters," Silvara murmured against his lips. "If you're staying, if this is real, then I need—" "Yes," Theron said simply, understanding what she couldn't quite articulate. Her private chambers reflected her personality, elegant but comfortable, with star charts on the walls and books stacked on every available surface. But Theron barely noticed the decor as Silvara led her inside, sealing the door behind them with a soft click that seemed to echo with significance. What followed was slow and reverent, an exploration of trust made physical. Silvara's ceremonial robes whispered to the floor, revealing the graceful lines of her form, fur gleaming in the lamplight. Theron traced the patterns with gentle hands, learning where she was ticklish, where she sighed with pleasure, where she needed careful tenderness. When his fingers brushed along her tail, she gasped and arched into the touch, no longer the composed diplomat, but simply herself, vulnerable and wanting and completely present. "I never thought I'd trust anyone like this," she whispered as they moved together. "I never thought I'd find someone worth staying for," Theron replied, his lips finding the sensitive spot beneath her jaw that made her tail tighten around him. They came together with gentle intensity, two bodies learning each other's rhythms, finding harmony in difference. Silvara's quiet sounds of pleasure mixed with Theron's whispered endearments, creating their own private language. When they finally lay tangled together afterwards, her tail still wrapped possessively around his waist, both were breathless and smiling. "The notice said 14 days, Silvara murmured, her head resting on his chest. "How long did your extension request specify?" "Indefinite," Theron replied, stroking the soft fur of her back, "which, in diplomatic terms, means until I decide to leave, and I have no intention of doing that."
She lifted her head to look at him, amber eyes luminous with emotion. "You changed your entire future for someone who started by being furious with you. You changed your perspective for someone who made a terrible first impression. I'd say we're even." Silvara laughed, that genuine sound he'd come to treasure, and kissed him again. "Stay," she whispered against his lips, "not because of duty or policy, but because I'm asking, because I want mornings with you, and evenings in the observatory, and a future neither of us planned, but both of us choose." "I'm already here," I promised, and they both knew he meant more than just physically. "For as long as you'll have me." Outside, the stars wheeled through their eternal dance, but inside Silvara's chambers, two people had found their own constellation, built not on a mistake, but on the courage to transform that mistake into understanding, respect, and finally, love.